He signed the papers in front of my face and smiled like a man who already owned my life. When I grabbed the folder from him, his hand pushed mine away hard enough to sting. Then he laughed and said, "Relax, Linda. This business will be ours. You don't need that title anyway." That was the betrayal. The greedy motive was plain: control of a $2 million business and everything that came with it. The shocking twist? The signatures were forged, the bank accounts quietly rerouted, and my own daughter had been fed a story that made me the villain. Want to know how I fought back and ruined him instead? Keep reading, and if you've ever been betrayed, remember, trust can be taught, but it can also be taken away. Like, comment, and tell me what you would do. I ran my thumb over the black ink, feeling the identical pressure and the same blotted curve on each forged signature. The document was clean, printed on legal letterhead, stamped with the corporate seal, the kind of paper that makes a lie look official. I could see now how he had done it: a few quiet meetings with the accountant, a late night at the office when I had left for a charity dinner, a notarized signature prepared when he had claimed to be helping with paperwork. Jason, my son-in-law, had learned how to copy my handwriting from the checks I had signed for years. He used knowledge I had given him and turned it into a weapon. He'd always been charming. That charm is how he married my daughter, Claire, how he worked his way into the business like a friendly vine wrapping itself around an oak. At first, I thought of him as a son. I took him fishing with me when he was a teenager struggling to find himself. I lent him money once when his first business failed. I trusted him with clients. I told him secrets about the company, how we'd survived the recession, which customers were steady, which vendors to avoid. Now I realized those secrets had been treasure maps for him. When the board secretary called that week to tell me about documents filed with the county, my stomach dropped. "We were surprised, Linda," she said. "There's a change of ownership filed last month. Jason's name is on it as managing partner, and well, we thought you should know." I felt my face go hot and cold all at once. I asked her to send copies. My hands trembled as I opened the PDF, transfer of ownership, effective date 2 weeks ago. My name was absent. My signature was there. The next days were a blur of phone calls, sharp meetings, and an ache that settled in my chest. Claire called me, voice small and confused. "Mom, he had to do paperwork. He said it was temporary, that you'd sign later. He said it was to protect us from taxes." The words came out in a rush. I could hear Jason in the background, instructing her to say comforting things. It was always about protecting the family when it suited him. Betrayal tastes like cold coffee and stale bread. The house that had been full of laughter and holiday dinners now felt like a courtroom. I stayed awake at night remembering all the small things I had done to keep our company afloat, taking client calls on weekends, sleeping on the office couch when a storm flooded the showroom, signing my name to loan papers to keep employees paid. That money, those years of work, had built this company. For Jason, it seems, it was a prize waiting to be snatched the moment I closed my eyes. I wasn't naive enough to think I could just storm into the office and demand everything back. Jason had done his homework. He had lined up allies, a friendly vendor, a quiet member of the board, the accountant who owed him favors. He had forged a narrative that sounded plausible, the benevolent son-in-law taking the reins while his aging mother stepped aside. He painted me as out of touch, stubborn, and in the way. And worst of all, he'd convinced Claire, who wanted nothing more than to believe her husband. But the twist that kept me awake with a burning righteous anger wasn't just the theft. It was the audacity. Jason had gone one step further. While he cut me out of ownership, he sent me an ultimatum. A letter slid under my door with clinical precision, typed in a font meant to sound official: either transfer the company assets to the listed accounts within 7 days, or we will initiate a forced buyout and pursue civil action for obstruction. The kicker was a sentence in small print: failure to comply will be considered an admission of incapacity. In other words, if I resisted, he'd claim I was unfit, replaceable, and use the courts to strip me of the business and my dignity. That was the moment the shaking in my hands stopped. This wasn't just a financial move. This was an attempt to erase me. To make me disappear from the place I had built. Something inside me hardened. The years of compromise, folding under pressure to keep the peace, paying payroll out of my own pocket, taking charity for the neighborhood kids, suddenly turned to fuel. I thought of my mother, who had started our company in a cramped storefront years before I took over. She had taught me to balance ledgers by hand when the electricity went out. She had shown me that the best defense against a liar is a record no liar can erase. So I started there. I dug through boxes in the basement, pulling out yellowed receipts, cancelled checks, and old ledgers. I called my old CPA Martin, who had kept meticulous notes even after he retired. Within 2 days, Martin was at my kitchen table flipping through invoices and murmuring like someone reading a mystery. "You kept everything," he said, impressed. "Not many people do that." He tapped a creased bank slip. "Here's the original loan agreement you signed 10 years ago to buy the equipment. Here's the notarized sale of the storefront from your mother to you. If this goes to court, this paperwork proves your ownership long before Jason ever walked through that door." Proof was one thing. Strategy was another. I couldn't simply walk into the courthouse screaming about forged signatures and hope the judge would act fast enough to forestall whatever Jason had already put into motion. He had already changed passwords, moved money, and subtly spread rumors about my erratic behavior. He had even suggested to some board members that it might be time for fresh leadership. The man had planned for every simple objection. But he had not planned for a slow, quiet, methodical person who knew where every receipt lived and how to use them. I began to build my allies. First was Martin, reliable, dry, and thorough. Then I went to Rosa, the office manager who had been with us for 20 years. She had watched me teach the new hires, made the payroll for decades, and known the company's clients like family. When I asked her to come in early the next morning, she didn't hesitate. "I felt funny about him for a while," she said, lowering her voice. "He started changing invoices, Linda. Little things. At first I thought maybe mistakes. Then I found duplicate payments to a vendor I never approved." Her eyes filled. I thought I was being dramatic. She handed me a stack of printed emails she had saved, notes about transfers, and a log of vendor payments. The pattern was ugly and clear. Piece by piece the puzzle joined itself. Where Jason had created a new narrative of benevolent takeover, the paper trail showed greed. Inflated contractor fees. Payments to shell accounts. A payout to a local shell corporation that bore his initials. He had been siphoning money, lining up investors who didn't know the full story, and installing himself as indispensable. The plan of attack was simple in its core: document everything, secure legal counsel, and then remove Jason's power before he could legalize his theft. I would not be the old woman who clung to a title, I would be the one who knew where the bodies of his lies were buried. But I needed more than paperwork. I needed leverage. That's where the human cost came into play. Jason had a weakness everyone assumes a manipulator never shows: vanity. He loved the social scene, the charity galas, the golf tournaments, the headlines. He liked to be seen as the guy who saved the business. To him, reputation was a currency as valuable as money, and in some ways more delicate. So while Martin and Rosa began compiling a formal audit, I began quietly talking to the people Jason had leaned on. A vendor who had been pressured into inflated invoices admitted to me in tears that he'd been paid back in cash for the difference. A junior accountant, terrified of retaliation, confessed that Jason had instructed her to change ledgers during late nights. At each conversation, I asked 2 things: 1, to preserve whatever documents they had; 2, to stay silent until we moved. Silence was harder to keep for Claire. She called almost every night, voice ragged with confusion and pain. "Mom, he says you're imagining things. He says you're trying to control him and he can't work under you. He cries, Mom. He says he's scared of losing everything." I could hear her heart breaking. She wanted to believe her husband, she had chosen him once, and grief makes people vulnerable. So I made another choice. I decided not to attack Claire. People who betray often do so not because they hate their family, but because they are greedier for something that looks like love on the surface. I knew I had to win back Claire's trust without tearing her further. I told her small truths, allowed her to see documents that the board secretary had sent with holes, and encouraged her to ask questions. She began to notice small discrepancies. "Why is there a payment to Silver Oak LLC?" she asked one night. "Jason said he approved it 2 months ago." That question was a thread, and threads unravel everything. As the days passed, my fury changed shape. It became a plan. I filed for a temporary restraining order against any transfers, notified the bank of suspicious activity, and engaged a lawyer who specialized in corporate fraud. We prepared to freeze accounts, to call auditors, and to file an injunction to block any changes in ownership. Jason had thought paper and notarized seals would be his shield. He didn't know how fast a bank will listen when threatened with criminal investigation. He hadn't expected vendors to suddenly grow honest when their own reputations were at stake. At night, when the house was quiet, I pictured his face when it all came down. Not because I wanted him hurt physically, but because I wanted him to feel the same exposed shame I felt when I saw that first forged signature. I wanted his social calendar to dry up, his business friends to whisper, the investors who had backed him to ask hard questions. I wanted the life he'd started building on lies to stutter in public. I did not breathe the word destroy aloud. I only whispered it into my pillow, then worked. Strategy needs restraint to be sharp. Fury without restraint is wasted fire. So I let legal letters replace melodramatic threats and precise evidence replace rage. Our audit would be clear. Our subpoenas would be clean. The week before the injunction hearing, Jason called. His voice, usually slick, was now a thin edge. "Mom, this is getting out of hand," he said. "Let's talk." I told him I would not meet alone, that any talk must be in the presence of counsel. He laughed. "Oh, now you make demands." But the laugh had no warmth. The morning of the hearing, the newsroom vans gathered like buzzards. I sat in the waiting room with Rosa and Martin, my papers heavy in my lap. Claire sat beside me, her hand trembling as she reached for mine. The moment the judge called us in, my heart thudded loud against my ribs. I wasn't naive. Jason had power, friends, and a charisma that can sway people. But I had truth, evidence, and the stubbornness of 3 generations of women who had run businesses, survived lean times, and stood when others would have bowed. When the judge asked who had prepared the transfer paperwork, the story began to unfold. The forged signatures, the shell payments, the hearsay Jason had used to build his case began to unravel under the weight of receipts and testimony. Each exhibit we showed was a brick in a wall that closed around him. And then, at the moment when the courtroom held its breath, when I felt the scales tip, the unexpected twist came. Jason stood, pale as a sheet, and accused me of falsifying the records myself. He said I had doctored the original documents to make it look like fraud. The room gasped. My face went cold. The twist cut deep, a new lie that promised to turn the world against me, to paint me as a manipulative matriarch trying to cling to power. It threatened to transform the hunter into the hunted. The judge leaned forward. "On what basis do you make that claim?" he asked. Jason smiled that same slow smile and said, "I've always known she was smart, Your Honor." "Too smart. She's been trying to control everything for years. I have evidence that shows she altered some of these files. It's in my petition." Silence thickened like wet clay. I felt Claire's grip on my hand tighten. The court stenographer's machine clicked. My mind raced. If Jason had manufactured that claim and had any way to back it up, then the battle would change shape again. If the judge believed him even a little, I could lose everything. But there, in the corner of my briefcase, was one last item I had nearly forgotten, an old ledger my mother had kept with her handwriting, and a notarized affidavit from a retired bank manager who had watched the original loan signings. It was small, but in a courtroom, small things can be the difference between justice and ruin. I slid it across to my lawyer. "For the record," I said, my voice steady though my heart skittered, "there is more." As the attorney stood, the room leaned forward. Jason's smile faltered for the first time. The air tightened into a single taut wire, and whatever came next would decide everything. The day after the hearing, Jason tried to act normal, but everyone at the office could see through the mask. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and his voice carried a sharp edge whenever he spoke. I walked through the lobby with Rosa, noticing how staff shuffled awkwardly, whispering behind hands. They were loyal, but scared. Fear was a tool Jason wielded expertly, and now I had to watch him attempt to reclaim his aura of control, even as the truth had begun to bleed through the cracks. Claire, my daughter, sat in my office, eyes red from tears, clutching her phone. "Mom," she said, voice trembling, "he told me he's going to dissolve the partnership if you don't back off. He said the company could fail without him managing it." The betrayal cut like a knife. My own daughter, almost convinced by the manipulator she married, teetering between loyalty to me and fear of losing her husband. I reached across the desk and held her hand. "He's bluffing, Claire. Don't let him scare you. We have the evidence. We have the law on our side." Jason's greed escalated daily. He began forging new memos, changing meeting schedules, and deleting emails from our shared server. Rosa and I watched him manipulate the younger employees, coaching them to claim they didn't see the forged documents. One morning, a junior accountant, pale and nervous, approached me in the break room. "Ms. Linda, I think he's going to fire me if I tell anyone," her voice cracked. "I can show you what he's done. I've saved emails and receipts, but I don't want to lose my job." I leaned closer, keeping my voice low. "Thank you for trusting me. You're doing the right thing. Just don't show anyone yet. We need a plan." Her eyes glistened with tears, and for a moment I felt the weight of all the years I had spent protecting this business alone. Now I realized I was no longer alone. Allies were quietly coming forward, fearful but determined. The humiliation wasn't just in the office. Jason had begun spreading rumors at local business gatherings, subtle cutting remarks about my erratic leadership, my inability to handle finances, and how Claire and he had to rescue the company from my mismanagement. At a charity luncheon, a longtime client leaned in and whispered, "I heard some things about management changes, is it true?" I smiled politely, refusing to answer, but inside I burned with a mixture of anger and frustration. This man had taken my trust and twisted it into slander. To fight back, I needed strategy, precision, and patience. That morning, I met with Martin, my retired CPA, at my kitchen table. He spread out spreadsheets, invoices, and bank statements like an artist arranging a canvas. "He thinks he can cover up the trail," Martin said, tapping one page after another. "But every payment to Silver Oak LLC, every phantom contractor invoice, every altered ledger entry is a line of evidence. We just have to connect the dots." I nodded, heart racing. "We'll need the board on our side. Rosa and I can gather sworn statements from employees who've seen the irregularities. And I want copies of all emails and server logs he's touched." My voice was steady, but my mind was alive with possibilities. Every move he made, every lie he spun, became part of the trap I was setting. Over the next week, I quietly began building the case. Rosa and I documented every instance of forgery, every unusual transaction. Martin verified each number and printed clean copies. I spoke individually with employees who had been intimidated by Jason's threats. We arranged secret meetings at cafes, in quiet corners of the office after hours, where the staff could speak freely. Each conversation added weight to the truth, irrefutable evidence that Jason's greed had overtaken reason. Meanwhile, Jason's arrogance was growing. He had convinced himself I was powerless. One morning, he stormed into my office, slamming a folder on the desk. "You're wasting time, Linda. The board already supports me. Your evidence is meaningless. Step aside, or I'll make sure you regret it." His voice trembled with the force of his own certainty. I looked at him calmly, leaning back in my chair. "You underestimate me, Jason. And you overestimate the loyalty of others. One misstep, and everything you've built on lies will crumble." My words were measured, but they carried the weight of every betrayal I had endured. His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He knew deep down that I was no longer the person who would simply watch while he stole everything. The first public humiliation came during a board meeting. Jason had called it, expecting to cement his control. The conference room was filled with partners and investors. As he began his opening speech, I stood and requested to present an audit, the documents Martin had prepared. Eyes widened as I handed out the sheets. "These payments," I said, pointing to entries in the ledger, "were never approved. These contractors," I continued, gesturing to another column, "do not exist. These transfers," I tapped the spreadsheet, "went to shell companies in his name." Gasps filled the room. Jason sputtered, turning red, unable to find words. One by one, board members whispered to each other, their expressions changing from surprise to concern. His confidence cracked under the weight of the truth, and I felt a sense of vindication. The humiliation was sweet, but the war was far from over. After the meeting, Claire approached, eyes wide with disbelief and relief. "Mom, I can't believe it. He lied about everything." Her hands shook as she held mine. "I'm sorry I doubted you." I hugged her tightly, whispering, "It's not your fault. He's very good at convincing people he's right. But we'll finish this." Jason, realizing the walls were closing in, escalated again. He began legal threats, sending letters claiming I had tampered with records, accusing me of defamation, and hinting at criminal charges. He was desperate, and desperation is dangerous. That night, I stayed at the office, reviewing every document again. I double-checked the notarized statements, the emails, the signed affidavits from employees. Everything was solid. Every lie he told had a counterpoint backed by proof. The following morning, I called my lawyer, Samantha. "We're ready," I said. "Let's freeze all accounts he's touched, file the injunction, and make sure the court sees the full audit." Her eyes sparkled with approval. "He won't know what hit him. The evidence is airtight." While legal maneuvers were underway, I also focused on psychological leverage. Jason loved attention and reputation. I quietly alerted key clients that there might be discrepancies in billing and that we were auditing the company. Whispers began circulating. Suddenly, Jason was the one being watched, scrutinized, and questioned. The man who had tried to make me appear powerless now faced uncertainty in every interaction. Then came the unexpected twist. Jason had secretly tried to lure Rosa away, promising her a higher position and more money if she would leave and support his narrative. I confronted her privately. "Rosa, did he say anything to you?" She shook her head, trembling. I almost said yes. But I couldn't. I'd be lying to myself and to you." I held her hands, grateful for her loyalty. That's why we win. Not just with law, but with truth. People can't ignore truth. Every day after, the tension built. Jason's phone calls became frantic, his meetings defensive. He tried to intimidate vendors, but they began to insist on receipts, approvals, and confirmations. His network of influence slowly unraveled. And yet, he still underestimated me. He believed I would act with rash anger, that I would let fury cloud my judgment. But I had learned something from every betrayal I'd faced in my life: patience and strategy always triumph over rage. Late one evening, I sat with Claire, discussing the next steps. "Mom," she said softly, "do you think he'll try something drastic?" I looked at her, hands folded, calm but alert. "He might. But now, we're in control. Every move he makes, we know about it. Every lie he tells, we can prove false. He doesn't realize we're not just defending, we're preparing to end this." As part 2 closed, I felt the shift. The hunter had become the hunted. Jason had escalated, humiliated, and threatened, but he had also revealed every weakness he had. The pieces were in place. The public exposure, the legal groundwork, and the allies who trusted me, all were ready. And when the next move came, it would be the one that changed everything. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the documents spread across the table. My heart still pounded, but the edge of fear had dulled into focused resolve. The war was escalating, yes, but now the counterattack was in motion. The next chapter would not be about waiting. It would be about action, and about making sure Jason never recovered from the life he tried to steal. He shoved the signed papers across the table again and sneered, "Sign it or I'll make sure the bank seizes everything." The betrayal was in the shove, the fake fury, an act meant to intimidate. The greedy motive was obvious: control of a $2 million business and the power that came with it. The shocking twist was this: while he pushed for a quick signature, he'd already rerouted critical payments and set up shell accounts to siphon funds quietly, and I had found the first trail. Want to see how I started to turn his playbook against him and ruin the life he'd been building on my back? Like, comment, and tell me how you'd respond if someone tried to steal your legacy. I remember the exact angle of the fluorescent light that day and how his smile looked practiced, like someone who had rehearsed 1,000 cons. But his confidence came with a cost. In his eagerness, he left fingerprints where a careful thief would not. That small arrogance is what I would use. While the boardroom drama had shown the world a surface of outrage and petty accusations, the real battle was in quiet rooms, in bank backoffs, and in people who were too scared to speak up until someone gave them permission. My plan had to be surgical, patient, and above all, strategic. There would be no melodrama, only precise, immovable pressure until the scaffolding of his lies collapsed. First, I fortified our legal posture. Samantha, my lawyer, and Martin, my retired CPA, met me in the conference room after hours. The evening light slanted through the blinds, striping the table with shadows. "We need an audit that can't be dismissed," Martin said, tapping a stack of clean copies. We need vendor statements, bank reconciliations, and sworn affidavits. Samantha nodded. And we need to secure any data he could alter. We have to act as if he'll delete things the moment we look away. I felt the cool click of resolve in my chest. Do it, I said simply. While they built legal armor, I worked on the human side. People are always the weakest link in a scheme, not because they're immoral but because they're scared. My first visit was to the shipping dock on the outskirts of town where our goods came in. There I found Marco, a broad-shouldered man who had worked for us for 15 years. He avoided eye contact at first, shifting his weight. Then he blurted, "I saw the invoices get changed. I didn't want to get involved. I thought maybe I was seeing things." He handed me a thumb drive. It contained scanned copies of delivery receipts showing discrepancies, dates changed, quantities altered. Marco's hands trembled when he told me he'd kept copies as backup because his conscience wouldn't let him throw away the truth. I thanked him and told him to stay out of sight for now. Next, I visited a small accounting firm 2 towns over where a junior bookkeeper, nervous and haunted, had left a voicemail on Rose's phone. She met me with reddened eyes in a diner booth, clutching a paper napkin where she doodled flowcharts. "He made me change the entries," she whispered. "He told me it was a temporary thing. He would fix it later. But it never stopped." I listened and then asked one question: "Do you have copies you can bring me?" She nodded, relief warring with fear on her face. "I'll meet you tonight." The human archive was growing slow and careful, like tendrils of truth curling out from under the rock he had tried to wedge over everything. I learned to project calm even when my stomach knotted in a dozen knots. If I looked frantic, people would suspect I was losing control. If I looked vengeful, some would freeze. What people needed was confidence and an organized place to direct their courage. So Rosa and I set up a neutral drop point, a small storage room at the community center where people could slide papers into an envelope and leave without seeing anyone's face. We called it our paper safe. When the first envelopes filled the tray, it felt like watching a slow river finally move after months of drought. The physical evidence was helpful, but money traces lived in systems. That's where the technical forensics came in. I hired a young digital investigator, Leah, recommended by Samantha. Leah had a steady gaze and fingers that moved over keyboards like someone playing an instrument. She secured the server logs, pulled caches, and began tracking access times. The picture she painted was methodical: late-night logins, VPN entries from odd IP addresses, and an unusually frequent pattern of file changes when Jason had been working late. Leah's tone was clinical. "He didn't just act, he scripted it," she said. "He planted decoys, then moved funds in small enough chunks to avoid detection at first." Her calm made me feel colder than anger. This was no garden variety embezzlement, it was a plan laid with the patience of a chess player. With papers and digital trails in hand, we tuned our strategy. A public expose would be tempting, revenge porn for the business world, but I needed to starve him of leverage before that stage. If investors panicked or he saw his social life unravel, he might lash out in messy, self-destructive ways that would make us regret immediate exposure. Instead, we worked incrementally. Samantha filed motions to freeze specific accounts tied to shell entities. Leah and Martin provided affidavits and technical exhibits. Rosa and I prepared witness statements, sworn and notarized. There was also the delicate matter of Claire. She oscillated between disbelief and shock. Sometimes she'd call late at night and say something small that made me ache. "He cried and blamed his childhood," she'd say, voice raw. Other times she defended him, listing small kindnesses he'd shown when money had been tight. I walked a careful line. I could not attack Claire, I had to let the truth reveal itself and allow her to choose. So when she came into the office and found a copy of an internal email thread that clearly contradicted what Jason had told her, I didn't shout. I simply sat and explained the context and how to read the paper trail. People who had power to betray most often banked on isolation. Reintroducing Claire to facts, step by step, loosened a knot of loyalty that had been tightened by charm and fear. In the background, Jason grew bolder. He attempted to intimidate Marco at the dock, showing up unannounced, voice low and menacing. He called the junior bookkeeper's mother, implying that her daughter's employment prospects might suffer if she got mixed up. He leaned on vendors, suggesting that contracts might be terminated if they did not comply. His moves were crude and public, the kind of direction that tells you a schemer is losing the finer parts of his game and resorting to blunt force. That's when we made the calculated pivot. Public pressure would be a lever, but only after the legal cage had been set. Samantha arranged a quiet meeting with several key clients and explained there had been irregularities under review and that, pending audit, the company requested patience and cooperation. The clients listened, and within a week 2 significant orders were paused pending clarification. Investors, sensitive to risk, started asking pointed questions. Jason, who once basked in the glow of handshake deals and gala photos, found his invitations dwindling. Vanity, which had once served him, had turned into vulnerability. But I wanted a specific surgical blow that would remove his ability to manipulate from inside. I needed his most reliable tool, his network of friends who pretended to support him publicly but would not stand up in court. There was one man in that circle who had been quietly uneasy, a local vendor named Harold who'd been complicit in dummy invoices. I visited Harold at his small workshop, where metal and wood smelled like sunlight and sweat. He was older, brittle, and tired. I sat with him in the corner, offered coffee, and told him the bare, honest truth. His business could survive this if he came clean, it would crumble if he continued to lie under oath. He avoided my eyes but eventually asked in a whisper, "What will happen to me if I speak?" I told him plainly, "You will be protected. We will make your truth part of our case. But you must decide now if you want to be part of their story or of yours." Harold agreed. He provided invoices, bank statements, and a small trove of cash receipts that tied payments to the shell company with Jason's initials. These receipts were ugly and human: coffee shop napkin memos, a hurried ledger entry, a receipt for a cash withdrawal with a shaky signature. They were the kind of proof that showed a man had lived in the messy world of bribery and had left tracks. With Harold's material and Leah's digital logs, Martin prepared a joint exhibit, a timeline interlacing payments, server accesses, altered ledgers, and suspicious vendor invoices. We printed it large and laminated it, the way detectives lay out clues in a movie. The day we presented it to the board was chilly and decisive. Board members shuffled through the timeline, brow furrowing as they traced the flow from our main account to the shell entities. A low murmur spread through the room, and I watched Jason's face lose its color as one by one, people stopped smiling and started asking the hard questions he could not answer. But he still had one last move, a desperate, ugly gambit. Late one night, he attempted to copy a set of deleted files onto a portable drive and smuggle them out via his assistant. Leah's watchful scripts detected the file movement and flagged it immediately. Samantha called the county police and filed for an emergency seizure. Officers arrived with warrants, their flashlights cutting through the night as they secured the server room. Jason, caught in the act, stumbled and tried to barricade himself in his office. The theatrics were pathetic. He was no longer the confident operator, he was a man scrambling to hide a ruin. When the police escorted him out, some of the staff watched from windows like witnesses to a petty but ruinous play. Claire, standing in the lobby, did not cry. She looked shocked, hollowed out by the realization that the man she had loved had become someone else entirely. Her eyes met mine, and there was sorrow but also clarity. That was all I had hoped for, not to humiliate her, but to free her from a lie. As Part 3 closed, the evidence sat in neat, overwhelming order. The timeline showed theft, manipulation, and malicious intent. The forensic traces lined up with confessions and receipts. The board was stunned, investors were alarmed, and the police had enough to pursue a criminal inquiry. It was not yet victory. Legal fights are long, and vindication is never guaranteed. But the game had shifted. Jason's life, built on borrowed charm and stolen funds, was unspooling in front of him. The next move would be his, desperate, dangerous, or self-sabotaging. And when he moved, we would be ready. The morning of the shareholder meeting arrived like a storm. Sunlight spilled through the large glass windows of the boardroom, hitting the polished oak table and casting shadows across the room that looked like fingers pointing at every guilty heart. Jason arrived with his usual bravado, but even from across the table, I could see the tremor in his hands. He had tried to act casual during his drive-in, speaking sharply into his phone and laughing loudly, but it was hollow. He knew the board had copies of the audit, the digital forensics, and witness affidavits. And he knew that I had orchestrated every revelation to appear at the exact moment when it would hit hardest. Claire came in behind me, a quiet, steady presence. She was dressed professionally, a cream blouse tucked into navy trousers, hair pulled neatly into a low ponytail. Her face reflected shock, sadness, and disbelief, but also a certain clarity. "Mom," she whispered as we sat, I think they're ready to hear everything." I nodded, squeezing her hand under the table. "Then let's give them the truth." Samantha began by introducing the audit documents, methodically presenting figures, timelines, and irregularities. I watched as Jason shifted in his chair, jaw tightening, face pale under the morning light. The first bombshell dropped quietly but effectively. An email thread from one of our vendors showed a payment adjustment with Jason's initials, referencing a company that didn't exist. Samantha explained it calmly. "This is one example of a pattern of redirection of company funds to shell entities under Mr. Jason's control. The board can verify these independently." Murmurs spread like wildfire. A senior partner who had trusted Jason for years leaned over to another and whispered, "This is unbelievable, all the transactions tie back to him." Jason tried to speak, opening his mouth to deny, but the weight of evidence pinned him down. Every denial would now sound like desperation. Every blink, every shuffle of papers, was a confession in motion. I stood and laid out the physical evidence: invoices, receipts, and notarized statements collected from employees. Each page told a story Jason could not deny: the forged delivery receipts from Marco, the tampered ledgers from the junior bookkeeper, the trail of digital logs Leah had meticulously recorded. Board members flipped through documents with a growing sense of outrage, shaking their heads, whispering to each other. One partner finally spoke aloud: "This isn't just negligence, it's deliberate deception." Jason tried one last manipulative tactic. He leaned forward, hands spread, voice loud but shaky. "I was trying to protect the company. If Linda had continued on her own, she would have failed. I only wanted to stabilize things." His argument fell flat. The auditors, the staff statements, the server logs, and even Claire's own testimony contradicted every word. He was exposed, and everyone in the room knew it. Claire stood, stepping in front of him. Her voice was trembling but firm. "You lied to me every day. You told me you were helping Mom, but you were stealing from her. I loved you, and you betrayed us." Jason's face contorted with shock and fury. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The room held its breath. His carefully built facade had crumbled entirely, replaced by the raw exposure of his greed and deception. I watched him closely, savoring the subtle shift in the room. This was the moment when power moved away from the manipulator and into the hands of truth. My years of experience, my careful planning, and my patience had led to this apex. I leaned forward and calmly addressed the board. "These documents are not an opinion, not a complaint, not conjecture. They are evidence. And they show a repeated intentional pattern of fraud, deception, and betrayal. I am prepared to pursue all legal avenues to protect this company and everyone who relies on it." Jason's face went red, and he tried to regain composure. He pointed at me, voice breaking. You set me up. This isn't fair. Everyone's against me." The room did not react with sympathy. Instead, people began asking pointed questions about each irregular transaction. Vendors confirmed statements, employees were ready to testify under oath, and even neutral auditors began checking every claim. Jason realized, with growing horror, that there was no escape. The humiliation escalated as the board called him out on discrepancies in public contracts. Every claim he had made about the necessity of his actions, every lie spun in private meetings, was now laid bare before witnesses. Partners who had once quietly nodded to his authority now challenged him openly. One older investor shook his head and said, "I trusted you for years. I never imagined this could happen. How do we reconcile this with everything you promised?" Jason's defenses crumbled. During the confrontation, I remained calm, measured, and composed. I did not raise my voice, did not accuse emotionally. I let the documents, timelines, and witness statements speak louder than words ever could. Every time Jason stammered or tried to redirect blame, Samantha or Martin supplied incontrovertible proof. It was cinematic, the predator unmasked in front of an audience that had once seen him as untouchable. The final blow came when we presented the evidence of his shell company and the siphoned payments. Leah walked the board through the digital logs in a clear, methodical way. She showed how the accounts had been accessed, funds transferred, and records manipulated. Each click, each timestamp, each modified file was a thread that Jason had left behind, and the board could trace it all without ambiguity. As the room digested the revelations, I noticed something remarkable. Jason's body language changed from defensive aggression to complete collapse. He slumped in his chair, eyes darting, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He had underestimated patience, strategy, and the quiet, meticulous gathering of truth. All of his manipulation had become his prison. Claire sat beside me, holding my hand. "Mom, it's done," she whispered. But I knew the work wasn't finished. Public exposure and legal accountability still loomed. Yet the most dangerous weapon he had wielded, secrecy, fear and manipulation, had been neutralized. The balance of power had shifted completely. After the board meeting ended, Jason was escorted from the building. Security kept a firm grip as he protested, but no one paid attention. Outside, the sun shone on the polished concrete, highlighting the moment of his downfall. Employees peeked from behind frosted glass doors, some with awe, some with relief. The man who had threatened, humiliated, and tried to steal from me was now a cautionary tale in the making. I stayed behind to talk to the board members individually, clarifying details, answering questions, and making sure the evidence was understood. Their expressions varied: shock, disbelief, admiration, but most importantly, they were now aligned with truth. When we finished, I took a deep breath and looked at Claire. "We did what we had to do. But we stay vigilant. Legal proceedings will continue, and we make sure he never threatens anyone again." That evening, as the office emptied and the city lights began to glow outside the tall windows, I reflected on the confrontation. There had been no shouting, no physical fights, no dramatic collapse, only a relentless, unyielding presentation of evidence and truth. And yet, the emotional power was immense. Jason had been publicly unmasked, his lies shattered, and his plans demolished. The satisfaction of justice, tempered with the weight of experience and careful preparation, was profound. And then came the cliffhanger. As I gathered my things to leave, my phone buzzed. An anonymous email appeared in my inbox, subject line: "You've won the battle, but the war isn't over. He has one last card, and it's deadly." I froze, staring at the screen. The boardroom had been victorious, Jason's life unspooling, but a shadow loomed. Even in defeat, he had the potential to strike in ways I hadn't yet imagined. The confrontation had been public, devastating, and complete in one sense, but it also set the stage for the next phase. Would Jason attempt revenge outside the law? Would he try to undermine me through other channels, to manipulate family or business contacts? The sense of suspense and tension hung thick in the air, a reminder that battles against betrayal are rarely finished with a single blow. I closed my laptop, staring at the city skyline. The war had shifted entirely into my favor, yet the threat of his final desperate move loomed. Claire sat silently beside me, understanding the weight of what had transpired and the precariousness of what was still to come. The end game was near, but no one could yet predict its form. The following morning, the city seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. I arrived at the office early, long before anyone else, the polished floors reflecting the soft glow of sunrise. The confrontation with Jason had been public, devastating, and final in one sense, but I knew the final pieces of the puzzle had to be carefully placed. Justice wasn't just exposure, it was permanent, undeniable, and irreversible. Samantha had already filed the injunctions freezing all of Jason's personal and corporate accounts linked to the shell companies. Martin was reviewing the final audit one last time, checking every number, ensuring nothing could be challenged. Rosa arrived, carrying boxes of documents from employees who had finally come forward, willing to testify openly. Each paper, each statement, was another thread ensuring that Jason's plans would unravel completely. Claire joined me in my office, looking calm but determined. "Mom, do you think he'll ever recover from this?" she asked softly. Her voice carried a mix of fear and relief. I shook my head. "He won't. Not from this. And if he tries to rebuild, the evidence is already out there. Every lie, every deception, permanent. He gambled with trust and lost." While legal proceedings slowly moved through the system, Jason made a final desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. He sent letters to clients claiming a misunderstanding, tried to charm former allies, and even attempted to manipulate Claire into forgiving him publicly. But each attempt was met with polite refusal, firm denials, and quiet documentation of his actions. His last illusions of power were crumbling faster than he could act. The real turning point came when Harold, the vendor who had quietly helped me gather evidence, testified openly in a preliminary court session. He spoke clearly, calmly, detailing the fraudulent invoices, the altered ledgers, and the shell accounts. His testimony was supported by Leah's digital forensic reports and Rose's collected statements. Jason's face, usually animated with charm and arrogance, was pale and taut, his hands trembling as he realized that every move he had made was documented and undeniable. News of the court filings began to circulate. Local business newspapers, sensitive to scandals involving substantial sums and prominent companies, began reporting on the case. Headlines didn't sensationalize or exaggerate, they presented facts. Business owner exposes fraudulent son-in-law, $2 million company protected through evidence and strategy. The story of his greed, manipulation, and betrayal spread beyond our office walls, and the humiliation that had begun in the boardroom now reached the public eye. Jason's arrogance was replaced by desperation. He tried to liquidate personal assets, transfer property, and even dissolve minor companies under his name to protect what remained. But every step had already been anticipated. Freezes, court orders, and forensic evidence meant he could no longer move funds without detection. The net had been drawn tight, and his frantic actions only highlighted how trapped he had become. I took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought us here. Years of building the business, late nights managing invoices and client calls, mentoring employees, and trusting the wrong man to marry my daughter, all of it had led to this crucible. Betrayal had been sharp and raw, but patience, strategic planning, and meticulous evidence gathering had transformed it into a decisive victory. The moral clarity was satisfying. Deceit and greed may rise quickly, but truth, preparation, and courage endure. Claire and I spent the afternoon going through the final documents with Samantha. Every affidavit, receipt, email, and log entry was catalogued, double-checked, and secured. "Mom," Claire said, closing a folder, "I feel like I can breathe again. It's like the weight of him trying to control everything is gone." I smiled faintly, feeling both relief and exhaustion. "It's not just gone," I said. "It's dismantled, piece by piece, with every lie exposed. And that's what makes it permanent." Outside, the sun was setting, casting warm light across the city skyline. Employees filtered out of the building, exchanging quiet congratulations. Even the younger staff who had once been intimidated by Jason's threats now moved with newfound confidence. They approached Claire and me, thanking us for standing up, for trusting them, and for turning fear into courage. I realized in that moment that victory wasn't just personal, it was collective. A toxic influence had been removed, and the company, and its people, could finally move forward. The final legal hearing arrived like a quiet storm. Jason, once brash and dominating, appeared timid, his confidence shattered. His lawyer tried to negotiate settlements, but the evidence was airtight. Every account, every manipulated transaction, every coerced employee statement had been meticulously documented. The court did not need persuasion, the truth was undeniable. By the end of the session, Jason's claims were dismissed, his fraudulent activities exposed, and his personal credibility destroyed. He left the courthouse quietly, head bowed, a man whose life had unraveled from greed and betrayal. Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered, cameras flashing. Claire and I stood side by side, calm and composed. One journalist approached and asked for a comment. I glanced at Claire, then looked into the camera. "Truth matters," I said simply. "Betrayal can take many forms, but patience, preparation, and courage will always expose it. Protect what you've built and the people you care about." Cameras clicked, but the words weren't for the headlines, they were for anyone who had ever faced manipulation and dishonesty. That night, back in the office, Claire and I sat quietly. The city lights twinkled like distant stars, a reminder that life moves forward even after storms. We reviewed the company's accounts, checked vendor agreements, and began planning for growth without fear of internal sabotage. The relief was profound, but there was also wisdom gained. Vigilance is key, trust must be measured, and courage is always the foundation of survival. Rosa, ever loyal, brought coffee and a quiet smile. "It's over," she said. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." I nodded. "It's over for now, but we have to stay careful. This isn't just about money, it's about integrity. And we've rebuilt it stronger than ever." The final confirmation came when our top clients signed renewed contracts, their confidence restored after reviewing the audit and seeing the transparency and leadership we had demonstrated. Employees returned fully to their duties, free from fear, and morale soared. Claire, now fully aligned with the truth, helped mentor younger staff, teaching them not only business skills but resilience and the importance of ethical conduct. Weeks later, Jason attempted one last ploy, emailing Claire in an attempt to reconcile, charm, or manipulate. She forwarded it to me unread. Together, we decided that communication with him would be limited to legal necessities. His attempts at influence were no longer threats, they were relics of a defeated ego. The man who had once tried to destroy my life was now powerless, stripped of credibility, reputation, and influence. Sitting in my office, reviewing the last of the evidence one final time, I felt a profound sense of closure. The journey had been painful, betrayal cut deep, trust was broken, and the emotional toll was immense. Yet through careful planning, steadfast patience, and unwavering courage, the betrayal had been turned into a lesson, a moral victory, and a permanent restoration of dignity. I glanced at Claire, who was organizing client files at her desk. "Do you feel proud?" she asked softly. I smiled, a mix of relief and satisfaction. Proud? Yes. But more than that, I feel free. Free from manipulation, fear, and deception. And wiser for it. We've protected everything that matters, not just money, but integrity, trust, and family. The moral truth of the story settled firmly in my heart. Betrayal can be devastating, but patience, strategy, and courage create victories that last far longer than vengeance alone. Protect your work, trust carefully, and never underestimate the power of truth. And to anyone watching or listening to this story, ask yourself, how would you act if someone tried to steal everything you've built? What would you risk, what would you protect, and how would you ensure that justice is served? As the lights dimmed in the office, Claire and I looked at each other and smiled. The nightmare was over. Jason's life, once built on deception and greed, lay in ruins. Our business, our family, and our trust had been restored. And the lesson was clear: betrayal may come in many forms, but courage, preparation, and unwavering commitment to truth are unstoppable forces that will always prevail.